Good. Yes, self-regulated learning is a huge topic in British Columbia, and Stuart Shanker was just out at your huge educational forum that you just hosted about 2 weeks ago, and you had 5 international speakers at that conference, and he was one of them. And so British Columbia has and Saskatchewan have really led the way in self-regulated learning, and so I'm thrilled to be here to share some of the journeys. And unfortunately, we only have an hour, so we're just going to be able to have a taste of it. And we had some great conversations this morning from teachers. Do we have any teachers in our audience? Oh, we do. Okay. From teachers this morning also that were able to contribute. And so certainly encourage you to call out and speak up. I can't see you, so you're just going to have to shout out. And just a reminder that we often, because it's only an hour, we often run out of time. So here's my Gmail address. I work in a lot of schools, and I have a lot of contracts around school districts. And so I'm working in schools and working in classrooms to support teachers. And so here's my contact information. So just a bit of a brief introduction as to what self-regulated learning is, because I worked with a principal last year who thought that all of the terms that I'm about to present were all separate and not connected. And after working with him for about 6 months, he went like this and said, "Oh, shoot, Brenda, do you mean they all kind of mean the same thing?" And I said, "Yes, Patrick." And so just a reminder that as we're going through our discussions on self-regulated learning, it is very, very much connected to our First Peoples principles of learning, where much research out there on Indigenous ways of knowing and teaching children how to be respectful and to be their own learners and to learn in nature and learn off the land. And there are many, many strong principles in Indigenous ways of learning that are rooted in self-regulation. One of the other key things that we talked a lot about this morning was the critical need to remember this piece of research that's been around for a long time, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and that we are born with the physiological needs that must be met before we look at emotional needs, which must be met before we look at higher level needs, which is cognition and our academics. And in many of the schools that I am asked to work in, these bottom pieces are missing, and therefore the top level is very hard to achieve. And so we had much discussion this morning around the physiological needs of children, that we're looking at nutrition, we're looking at sleep, we're looking at fitness. And the research is telling us that our children are in chronic sleep deprived states, and our children today are not as physically fit as they were. And both of those areas, including nutrition in the schools that I work with have stronger nutritional programs, but the sleep and the physical activity are the 2 areas that are harder to control. But there is very strong research that correlates sleep and learning and physical fitness and learning. And so we no longer can refute that information, that we really are looking at the whole holistic approach. And so there are many physiological needs that must be met, just like you in this audience have physiological needs that must be met in order for you to learn optimally. And Robin this morning, when I was listening to him, he talked about flow. In order to get to flow, which is all of this, we must have those physiological needs met. It's very hard for you to be in flow and then we go into our emotional areas that need to be met, and then we come up here. And so again, that's just a reminder for us in education that we are looking at the holistic child and that we are looking at meeting the needs. Another term that comes up is this concept of differentiation. So as parents, as teachers, you will hear the word, we need to differentiate instruction, which means, once again, how do we personalize it? How do we look at individual differences so that children can get into that flow? And what looks like flow for you can be very different from what looks like flow to you, which is different for you. And so we're trying really hard to look at how do we differentiate, because the research is telling us that it is no longer one size fits all in education. that we somehow have to meet the needs of our multi-complex learners in our classrooms. And the work that I'm doing in this Tier 1 universal strategies are trying to help teachers look at classroom composition and know how to meet those needs. The other term in British Columbia I hear a lot more about is inclusive education. In the Northwest Territories, their entire department in education is looking at inclusive education. So inclusive education is how do we keep kids in classrooms, looking at differentiation, looking at diversity, and looking at the classroom compositions. Now, in British Columbia, your ministry talks about personalization. So in each province I work in, it is different. When I work in Ontario, they look at universal design for learning and self-regulation. In Saskatchewan, they look more at self-regulated learning. In the Northwest Territories, it's much more about inclusion. In British Columbia, your ministry has looked at personalization for several years. And so it is a continuing journey. When you Google them, that British Columbia is looking at how do I personalize learning for all children in classes to get to that critical flow that Robin talked about. Again, this is another term that you might hear out in the field, universal design for learning. As parents, I think it's really important to understand these terms. This is another critical field of research that looks at how do I personalize for children. So how, as a teacher, as a parent, how do I have multiple means of expression? How do I get multiple means? Representation is how do you represent your work? Multiple means of expression is how do I talk about my work? And this one here is multiple means of engagement. So when I'm in classrooms and we're thinking, oh gosh, we can't just present information in one way anymore because we have all of these needs in our classrooms, it's looking at how do we take one concept and have multiple ways of presentation so we get multiple ways of engagement. So the engagement piece is critical. And if you look at the research coming out of the Canadian Educational Association, they have wonderful charts there looking at the downward spiral of engagement as children go through the system. And it's quite alarming to see that we start school with a high level of engagement, and as the school years go on, our engagement declines. And so we know that we can't get to that critical flow unless we are engaged. And so this is a very critical piece in Ontario. What I'm working there is how do we have different ways of engagement. Now the other piece is 21st century learning. That's another word as parents you'll hear a lot about. So you're going to hear personalization, you're going to hear differentiation, you're going to hear inclusive education, you're going to hear universal design for learning, and another big one is you're going to hear 21st century learning. Now the major CEOs of Canada just published an article in the Globe and Mail about 6 months ago, and the major CEOs in Canada were asked what skill sets are they looking for in their new future employees. So I want you to think about that. What do you think these CEOs were saying? I'm going to give you a bit of a hint around this. There's a brilliant economist named James Heckman out of, I think he comes from Harvard, comes from one of the biggies in the United States, and he has studied effects of education economically. And he talks about two skills, hard skills and soft skills. And hard skills are literacy data, numeracy data, and soft skills are your ability to think as more your ability to know how to learn. And so what do you think the research is telling us? What do you think those major CEOs were looking for? If you're running a company, what are you looking for in your future employees? Pardon? Flexibility. So cognitive flexibility. Yep. Okay. Yep. Critical thinking is another one. Yes? Creative problem solving. So are these hard skills or soft skills? These are soft skills you're talking about. Pardon? Interpersonal skills. Yep. Working as a team, collaboratively, yep. So problem solving. So the next slide is going to talk about these. What are the skill sets that we're looking at? The only one you haven't talked about is organization, that these major CEOs felt they wanted their kids to be good problem solvers. They wanted their children to be able to work, their young people to work in a group. They wanted to be, for them to have flexibility. They wanted them to be strong oral communicators and written communicators, and they wanted effective time management. So, and they were all consistent in what they were looking for. And so when you pull up this next slide about the definition of a 21st century learner, it is very much talking about those soft skills. So when we're looking at the ability to think critically, we're looking at the ability to problem solve. The research is no longer telling us that we want children graduating with all the answers. The research is telling us that we want children graduating knowing how to learn. That is a big shift in education, from knowing what to learn to knowing how I learn. And so what we're looking for now is a word called metacognition, where we're asking kids, how do you think you're learning? And so I was just reading an article on the plane. There's a researcher in the field of education called Robert Marzano, and he published a book called The Classroom Walkthrough about 5 years ago or 6 years ago. And he used to walk through classrooms and look at teaching practices. And now the superintendents I'm working with and the classrooms I'm working with, and this new book is walking through classrooms and talking to kids about how do you know, like the problem solving approach. What job are you working on? What do you think your plan might be? How do you know your plan might be working or not working? How do you know when to go on to get a different plan? So that's what we're looking for in education now, are those conversations with kids about how they learn. So innovation, communicator, collaborator, globally aware, civically engaged, self-directed learner, huge in the research, huge in the research. Can we give children a task, and do they know what to do, and do they know when to get help? And do they know when to stick it out? It's called grit, and you'll see it over and over in the research, and about the ability to stay on a task and to work it through. And at the bottom, information media literate and financially. So Ontario has just added to their curriculum the concept of being financially and economically literate. So James Heckman would be very pleased with this, because these are all what we call soft skills. So none of these CEOs are looking for these hard skills, right? And so unfortunately, our report cards still are looking at what? Our hard skills, right? So, but I'm always talking in schools that you could have 7 different children working at a level H in reading and all have different strategies on how to get there. And so we're trying to move past just the hard number and look at how they're learning. Now, this word has come up a lot recently in the research, this concept of neurodiversity. And I talk about this all the time, that each of our brains has its own fingerprint. So each one of you in this room has its own, when you're thinking, it has your own imprint. And so that's why we have to move past this one size fits all, and we have to look in our classrooms at the neurodiverse needs of our learners. And when I'm looking at the neurodiverse needs of our learners, I'm working with our teachers to try to figure that out. Because we have many, many different learners in our classrooms, and the work that I'm doing is trying to help teachers learn how to look at that neurodiversity. So this would be a very powerful term in the research, and probably the most common word that I would use in my work, that looking at the neurodiverse needs of these children. And every child in a classroom, sometimes, I'm not saying every child needs a different strategy, but we often need to go into classrooms and observe and find out what strategies these children need in order to learn at that optimal level and to learn at what Robin talked about in terms of flow. And then many of you have heard Stuart. Have people seen him when he's come? Okay. So he's probably our leading researcher in Canada right now, looking at self-regulated learning. And he has come out very distinctly in his research that that IQ was the predictor of success in the 20th century, and that self-regulated learning is now the predictor of success. So we are looking at that, and so as we're moving children out of kindergarten and graduating our children in kindergarten, what did we used to look at a measure of success? What was our measure before? Was their letters, numbers, shapes, and colors, right? Their knowledge, the hard skills, like their knowledge. And now we're looking at the soft skills and looking at this concept of self-regulated learning. And are these children showing us evidence that they can learn? Are they showing us evidence that they can regulate their behavior? Are they showing us evidence that they can regulate their emotions? Are they showing us evidence that they can problem solve? So we're looking at things very, very differently now. And so we're kind of in a state of transition because our report cards right now don't necessarily reflect the soft skills. And so the audience this morning told me they couldn't see this very well, so I apologize for this. I'm gonna have to change the color in this. So I'm just trying to tie these concepts in so that we all know that when people talk about neurodiversity and Maslow's needs and personalization and inclusive education and differentiation and UDL and 21st century learning, it all comes under the umbrella of self-regulated learning. Someone asked this morning about project-based learning and inquiry-based instruction. Project-based learning is a tool, is a hands-on learning tool from which to further your understanding. Inquiry-based instruction is a wonderful, again, it's a tool of how to ask higher level questions so that children can increase their understanding. Just like my computer is a tool for me to learn. And so those are all approaches to education that are looking at increasing understanding. Because the research is telling us that sitting still for extended periods of time and having people talk at you like I am today is not our most efficient way of learning. That project-based learning where we're actually engaged and inquiry-based instruction, where we're asking higher order questions, is the more efficient way to learn. So we talk about 5 areas of self-regulated learning in the work that I do, and we're going to go through each of these quickly. The physical is the first, and again, there are many components of this room right now that you may be aware of, like the temperature of the room, the lighting of the room, the comfort of your seating. Is this room overly cluttered or not cluttered? So there's many physical components that people need in order to be physically regulated. How much sleep you've had last night, what kind of meal you had at lunch. So those are all physical components that help you stay in a just right state in order to learn. And then we move up to the emotional piece, and I think that's what Robin was talking about this morning, was do we have children in a just right emotional state in order to learn? And I work in many, many schools where the stress of the classroom is so high that it affects the teacher and the students, and optimal learning up here does not happen. So I do a lot of work in emotional self-regulation, so I'm excited to sit in on Robin's presentation after this to learn more about what he has to say about this area. But this whole area of mental health is exploding, and we're trying to look at it very carefully in our schools and in our classrooms to make sure, in order to get optimal functioning up here, to get in the flow, then this part of the brain must be regulated. The other piece that must be regulated in classrooms is behavior. And how much time, part of our energy are we putting into behavior in our schools? Do you think we're putting more up here or more here? A lot of our energy goes, those of you that are teachers in the room, a lot of your extra funding would go where? Behavior. So I'm spending a lot of my time, I just came out of a grade 5 classroom in Nanaimo, and lowest data in the province, and there were 32 behavioral routines that were not in place that should have been in place for those children to learn. 32. So I'm going into classrooms and watching to see what things need to be in place. What behavior routines need to be in place? Can children transition into the locker room without killing themselves? Can they go from the locker room to their desk without killing themselves? Can they put away their materials in an organized fashion? Can they leave their classroom to walk to the gym without becoming dysregulated? So there are so many behavior routines that must be in place in order to have a stress-free classroom and a stress-free teacher. It's very hard for teachers to be in some of these environments when the behavioral routines are not in place for children to learn. And so these three things, the physical environment, the emotional environment, and the behavioral environment, I find are the most important in order to fly up here. But I can't fly up here unless I've got these other things in place. So I see teachers nodding in the audience, right? You know this. That is, you can spend your evening, your weekend planning the most amazing lesson plan. But if your children come in and they haven't slept and they haven't eaten and they haven't exercised all weekend and they've been on video games all weekend, and then there's emotional things that they're carrying in from either their homes or their playgrounds or the bus ride, and their behavior's out, it is really hard that lesson plan is going to flourish the way you want it to. So I spend a lot of time in these three areas. And so what we're wanting is that we want our children to be calm, alert, and focused physically in order to learn. You want them to be calm, alert, and focused emotionally in order to learn. You want them to be calm, alert, and focused behaviorally and socially, and then academically. And all too often, where do we try to go first? We go right to the top. So I work with lots of administrators too. Some of my administrators I work with might be a little more data-driven, and the data around literacy and numeracy, and I'm always reminding them that the data is only as strong as your foundation. And so that sometimes we need to spend time here in order to build it here. And there's another woman this morning that talked again about the transactional nature of self-regulated learning, and she said, and I said that it is extremely transactional. So if a child is sitting in class and his neurodiverse needs are not being met academically, and he starts to get bored, his behavior goes out, he starts to physically wander a room and gets into difficulty socially. So they're all connected. A child can come in with sleep deprivation, which affects them emotionally, which affects them behaviorally, which causes them not to learn. A child can come in off the playground with some significant emotional incident, which affects his behavior in a classroom, which affects his physical ability to learn, which affects his ability to learn academically. So they are all connected. But our job is to try to figure out where the breakdowns are. And the other thing that we talked a lot about this morning was a tiered approach to learning. And how many of you in this room would be familiar with response to intervention? So it's not as much of a concept in British Columbia as in Saskatchewan adopted a response to intervention model about 5 years ago. And Saskatchewan moved out of a designation model to a needs-based model. So in British Columbia right now, a lot of your funding is based on a designation, and in Saskatchewan they abandoned that model and went to a needs-based model, and with that they went to a response to intervention model, which means it's a tiered approach to learning. And the research is telling us that in the green area, 80 to 85% of what we do should be happening in classrooms, on playgrounds, in lunchrooms, in hallways, in libraries, in French rooms, in music rooms. So most of the work that we're doing, and so I have a lot of contracts with speech language pathologists, with psychologists, with occupational therapists, and with counselors who typically have not perhaps worked in classrooms, but have pulled children out. So a tiered approach to learning means that 80 to 85% of what we should be doing should be happening in this green area first. And then we come up to the yellow area, which is your tier 2. That's your small group work. And finally, your red here is your pull-out. And that should only be about 3 to 5% of what we do for kids at school. And this research is consistent across every piece of research. It is always about an 80 to 85%, 15 up here, and about a 3 to 5 up here. But in my experience, where do we often go first? If you have issues with children in schools or classroom, where do we go first? We go here. We go here. And so when we instituted this model in Saskatchewan, it really forced us to look in classrooms, in playgrounds, in hallways, because before we filled out a Tier 3 referral, we had to articulate the Tier 1 work that had been done for that child. And in my work last year in the Nanaimo Ladysmith School District, I worked with a brilliant superintendent named Dave Hutchinson, and he very wisely asked his district that they could not fill out a Tier 3 referral until there was evidence of Tier 1. And that's what would be very supportive in the research. That how have we gone into a classroom to observe children, to support teachers before we pulled a child out of a classroom? So that is a bit of a shift in British Columbia, but it's a very strong shift happening in the Northwest Territories, very strong in Saskatchewan, growing in Alberta, and certainly growing in Manitoba. And again, these are all connected. So another term that is extremely important is the word metacognition. And metacognition is knowing how you learn. So when we talk today about personalization, there's no use personalizing learning if the child cannot articulate how they learn. So as learners, we want our children to be able to say, if I am going to learn about bottled water, the best way for me to learn that would be to blah, 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 right? That's metacognition, is articulating how you learn. So in my work, I make up metacognitive portfolios for children to talk about how their brain works. Most of the portfolios out there would be what? More content driven. This is what I did, and what I want to be able to articulate for our children is this is how I learn. And that would be the biggest change and the biggest shift. So my husband is a university professor, and if he asks his fourth-year university students, he teaches exercise physiology. If he says, oh, we are coming up to a new unit, the unit is on the circulation system, how do you think you guys might want to learn this? What do you think the majority of his students say? Pardon? No. No. Pardon? No. They say, I don't know. None of them say that. That would be brilliant, even if they said that or that. They say, I don't know. And then he can cue them more, and he can say, okay, you don't know. Okay, so we're going to learn about the circulation system. We're going to have a visual choice. We might have a kinesthetic choice over here. They still say, I don't know. And they want the grade to get out. And so we're not even there yet at the university level where children can say, hey, I'm a visual learner and I learn much better. But I think we've done a little bit of that in education, but we haven't done it enough to truly integrate it into children so that they can articulate. If they're on a bus and a bus driver gives them auditory directions, that they could say, whoa, I don't learn that way. I need to write it down. Or I really need to use a motor memory system. So what we're really looking at is, do we have knowledge about the brain, and can these kids articulate how they learn? And when I go into my husband's classes and I probe, I'm finding a lot of I don't knows. And there was a brilliant prof last year at the University of Regina in education that was let go because she approached her education classes in a highly metacognitive way. And so she said, well, the curriculum says we're supposed to be learning about movement in learning. How do you think we might learn about that? So what do you think happened to her? Were the students comfortable with that? No. They wanted to know what I have to learn. You tell me what I have to learn, and I want you to tell me what the grading system is, and I want you to tell me. So when she opened it up and she said, I want you to, so there's a university that's opened up in Squamish. I think it's about $35,000 to $40,000 to go there. Does anybody know about that university? Quest? So it sounds like a dynamic place where you go and study an inquiry question and you learn at your own pace. And mean, that's where the brilliance of metacognition is, but where other universities are not there yet. And so metacognition is, do I know what my job is? Do I know what my plan is? This biggie here, am I self-monitoring to know if I'm getting it? And then I go back and check. But who's usually doing this for kids in school? The teachers, right? Or the educational assistants. Yes?
My son was in grade 6 and he told the teacher what kind of learning he was. Like he was a non-sequential learner, gifted visual learner, and that didn't really go down very well.
Wow. I often work with the kids I work with to teach them scripts on how to talk to teachers. And I'm not saying your son was disrespectful in any way at all, but I know that with my own 4 children, I'm at the other end if they need me, and I will get them to try at first to say, excuse me, could I please learn it this way because my brain looks better this way? And then if they have, then I have to go in.
It may have been used in a different context, and that's kind of how it's there. Maybe the may have used in a different context that wasn't valuable in that moment, but yeah, it's glad that he was able to verbalize that.
Absolutely.
I wasn't sure that the outcome is exactly what he anticipated.
Right. And so that's when I go in as a parent and support. And I usually haven't had to, but I've worked hard with my children. Again, I'm not saying in any way that your son was inappropriate, but I've had to teach my children exactly how to approach, when to approach, right? And so, yeah, those kind of things are, and even at the university right now, I have 2 children at UVic and I have 2 in Saskatchewan, and I found the profs out here very approachable, that if they meet them after class and say, excuse me, or if they make an appointment with them and say, excuse me, I'm finding that sitting for extended periods of time with your PowerPoint is not the way my brain, so if you depersonalize it, right, teach them really hard, do never personalize. This is not about your prof, this is about how your brain works. Is there any way I can do this? And I find that if we teach them that strategy, this is about how my neurodiversity works, then we get a much further ahead than if I say, well, I'm sitting in your class. It's the pronouns that so I've worked really hard with them and practiced with them because it is about them. It's not about, we're not here to judge a professor or a teacher. It's what are we learning from this? Some of you may say today, geez, Brenda, you're talking way too much. And I would look at my watch and say, oh, shoot, I got another 15 minutes and I have to stop. So anyways, all about that feedback. So it's unfortunate for him, and I hope he doesn't stop. I hope that he keeps thinking about how his brain works and how he can. But the metacognitive portfolios are really, really helping, because the metacognitive portfolios go with the children and the teacher receives them and he says, hey, I'm Jeremy, and when I'm listening, my brain listens better with this. And so the teacher gets these metacognitive portfolios, and it's just a great conversation to start. And so that's what metacognition is knowing how you learn, And so what we want our children to be able to do is metacognitively know, like in terms of our physical environment, we want our children to be able to articulate, does that environment work for you physically, or does that environment? And just because that environment works for my brain, I'm not saying that environment doesn't work for you, but I want the metacognitive understanding that tells me that this environment I can focus on because. Now my husband is interesting because his office looks like that. But you know what he's always seeking? He'll go from that and he'll seek this and he'll mess this area up, then he goes on to the next one, then he goes on to the next one. And so it tells me something about his learning. He's really seeking an organized environment, but he has no metacognition around what works for him or what doesn't work for him. And so all I'm doing in the physical environment when I go into classrooms, and this came up this morning a lot with 2 teachers in the audience, we ask our children. These classrooms are for our children and for teachers too. Like, it has to fit the teacher preference also, because the teacher has neurodiverse needs also. But we ask our children in our classes as early as grade 1, what physical aspects or emotional or behavior, what is working in this classroom and what needs to be tweaked. And you will be quite amazed at the conversations that you get when you start asking kids if the environments are working for their learning. And so that's where the metacognition starts. It really starts in grade 1. So we want, same with emotional self-regulation, because who's usually calming that child down at school? Principal, principal, vice principal, teachers, educational assistants, right? So what we want is that metacognition for children, and you can develop it by about grade 4, the ability for them to know, ooh, I'm emotionally dysregulated. What do I need to do to get myself back just right so that I can be calm and regulated in order to learn? So that's the difference between a behavioral compliance approach. Somebody asked me at lunch what I do, and it was a wonderful conversation I had with a public health nurse. I don't know if she's in here. I talked to her about a lot of the work I do, and I said I work in schools and I move them out of a behavioral compliance model, because what does a behavioral compliance model do for that child? Yeah, it tells him what to do, right? It tells him to calm down, it puts him away. Does it teach him how to do it differently? No. And the research is telling us very significantly that we have to move out of a behavioral compliance model where we're teaching children what to do and teach them how. And so the one message you can leave today from me is to teach them how. And that's what self-regulated learning is about. So we have to teach this young man how to get out of this state and come down to this state by himself when you're not there. And I'm not saying that you'll never need help, but as that's what our goal is. The same with behavioral. Who's usually stepping in here? The adults, right? So what we're trying to do is teach the children how to regulate their own behaviors so that children at a very early age can learn how to regulate their behaviors on their own. The same with social regulation. Lots of social regulation coming on. So our goal, when you guys talked about it, your CEOs of Canadian corporations, they would be thrilled with this picture. First of all, the teacher's here, you can't even see who she is. So these children are engaged in this wonderful conversation. They are teaming, they are sharing, they are learning. Does it look physically conventional? So most of the classrooms I'm working in would look like this. You would not see isolated rows of desks. You would not see chairs. You would see a lot of group work. You'd see a lot of floor work. You'd see a lot of project-based work so that we can move children into this wonderful concept of what do I need in order to learn? What do I need right now in order to learn? And so what we're wanting is this development. This is another key word in self-regulation. Because when babies are born, are they born as self-regulators, or what do you do to help them regulate? What are the things that we do universally to help a baby regulate? Pardon? I'm sorry? A schedule. That's a great one. I haven't heard that one for a while. Yes, and so how do we respond to it? We nurture them, right? So when I was standing in a thrift store lineup the other day and a woman was doing this, and I said to her, where do you work? And she said, in a nursery. And I said, she said, how can you tell? I said, because you're rocking. And so what do we do universally to calm a baby? Do we move fast or do we move slow? We move slow, right? When we try to calm a baby, do we talk really fast or we talk really slow? Slow, right? When we're trying to calm a baby, do we kind of hold them out or do we hold them tight? Right? So there are things that we do universally, no matter what culture you're in, you do those universally to try to calm a baby. That's called co-regulation. So babies are not born self-regulated, they are born into co-regulation. And I loved your comment about scheduling. That doesn't come up very much, right? So these are all sensory things that I talked about, but that would be more of a cognitive thing, that you're getting kids into a tight schedule. So what we want in terms of our work with children is to move them out of this behavioral compliance approach and into the self-regulation. So we initially work very closely with a child or a young person, and then develop the ability to self-regulate. So right now, a coach is with this young man. He is co-regulating this young man. This young man is not on his own yet, but we want to develop that so he's self-regulated. So many of our children in school never leave this state because they always have someone telling them to slow down, to stop talking. They never leave this state. And what we want is to build co-regulation into self-regulation. Same with in our early years. If this woman here is not coaching these kids how to put those blocks away, if she is just telling them, put the blocks away, do you think that she's going to develop self-regulated learning? No. So behavioral compliance, if you tell someone what to do and how to do it, will not develop self-regulated learning. If you teach them how to do it, that will develop the independence and self-regulated learning that they need. So that is a key concept. So when I work with any educational assistants in the audience, when I work with educational assistants, a key concept I work with the educational assistants is moving educational assistants from a co-regulation state to a self-regulation state. Because what do educational assistants usually stay at with kids? Right? Educational assistants usually stay right beside kids. Very rarely do I see the ability to teach kids how to work by themselves. And that is a key point. Our educational assistants are very important to our work, but we have to be using them as effectively as possible and teaching them how to teach children to move from a state of co-regulation to a state of self-regulation. So that's a really important point. It's the same with emotional, right? We often need someone else to emotionally co-regulate us. Lots of research out there on animals and pets, co-regulating it. My dog is my best emotional co-regulator. She is. She attunes to me 10 times more than my husband ever would. Like 10 times more. She reads my behavior, she reads my emotions, she comes to me, and so she emotionally co-regulates me better than any other person in my family, right? So lots of research out there about attunement with animals, but if I can't have her with me all the time. She is brutal on an airplane, and so I have to learn how to emotionally self-regulate myself without her. And it's the same with that we often need in our lifetime people to emotionally co-regulate us, but we have to develop this emotional self-regulation as we go on. And the research out there on mirror neurons here, this is a mirror neuron in this part of your brain, and this is a mirror neuron here, that this is what I work with whole schools on helping adults learn that they play key roles in emotionally co-regulating kids. Key roles. Because when the adult smiles at the child, what happens to the child's brain? It smiles. It smiles. So the mirror neuron here affects the mirror neuron here. So when the adult shows this great empathy and warmth to a child, the parts of the brain in that child light up. And so I spend a lot of time in schools helping teachers because teaching is a stressful job. And in many of the classes I go into and I feel the stress, I can't imagine as a teacher working in that all day. So we have to somehow build wellness in our schools for teachers and help them know that when we have this beautiful body language toward our students, that is an emotional co-regulator. And do we feel like that sometimes? So many of the schools I work in, we have redesigned their staff rooms to be a place of wellness. And so what would we do differently in a staff room? What would we do differently in a staff room? What would create more of an emotional co-regulation wellness experience? Lighting, yes. Would we have lights like this? No, right? So lighting would be subdued. What else in a staff room would we do? Think of spas, people. What else would we do? We'd have what kind of music? Comfortable furniture. Would we have hard plastic chairs? No. Different colors. What kind of colors? Soft, natural colors. Yes, so we're going to change the lighting. We're going to put in comfortable furniture. What else did you say? Soft colors. What else? What kind of music? Soft background music. What else? Think of a staff room. What else would you do? Add nature. Yes. Temperature. Yes. Okay. Awesome. There's one thing we're missing. What's usually all over staff rooms? Clutter, right? Clutter. So I have worked with amazing schools that have redone their staff rooms, and we've seen significant changes in our teachers. And I think one of the parent groups, I don't know if anybody's from North Vancouver here, one of the parents did that for their staff rooms last year. We have seen significant changes in our teachers, but I am doing that in classrooms because I believe that that's what a classroom should look like. So the classrooms, when I present for longer periods of time and I have a chance to show more of the work that we're doing, our classrooms are looking like that. So we are decluttering classrooms, we're adding comfort, we're neutralizing color, we're bringing in nature, we're bringing in soft lighting, we bring in soft music, and we are therapizing classrooms and deinstitutionalizing classrooms, and we're seeing significant changes in our children. But those are all universal principles of how we would calm classrooms. And I don't have we missed anything? We've talked about auditory, we've talked about visual, we've talked about temperature. The only thing that I'm adding in many of mine is an exercise bike, because exercise can be very regulating for many of us. And so in some of the classrooms that we've redone in Saskatchewan, we've added an exercise bike in the staff room, and that has been very, very positive.
How do you think of a fish?
Ah, yes, yes. So the visual, right? The concept of having a pet, and also the visual of aquarium, is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, just one fish would be all you need.
Yep. And sometimes people are bringing in electric fireplaces and having that calming. Yes?
I'm just thinking of water. I'm sure that
Yes.
that room has a lot of coffee going on all the time.
Yeah. Yes. And the staff room in Moose Jaw, we added a little. Yes. Yes. You guys should be in the design of yes, exactly. So if you think about a spa across Canada, not every spa would look the same, but the principles of how you would calm people are the same. And I'm often doing that in the schools that I work in, because teachers are working so hard. And if I can get the physical environment to work for them instead of against them, then we're seeing significant change, so that we may not feel like this at the end of the day. And so we're looking at, again, this concept of hoping to move from this person always being with children to the end of the day where they are co-regulating on their own. This was a great story. This was up in Port Hardy. And again, when I say a lot of the work that I do is moving out of behavioral compliance, where we're telling kids what to do. We changed our playground. So everybody show me with their body, what, if I said the word supervisor, what would tell me what your body tells you to do if I say supervisor. Sit up straight. If I'm a supervisor on the stage, what am I wanting to do with my arms? Cross them. Again, universal, right? I'm wanting to kind of go like this. And if I'm supervising, I'm kind of what? Like this? Okay. So if you're a supervisor on a playground, what are you doing? Similar, right? You are waiting for what? You're waiting for bad behavior, and then what do you do? You step in, right? And then what happens? You tell them what to do, break it apart, and there's usually what? A consequence, right? We changed our supervisors into coaches. So when I was out on the playground up in Port Hardy, they hired me just to work at the playground, because it's like at the end of the day, at the end of each break, there was like 22 kids outside the principal's office. And by the time the principal got through each one, then it was lunchtime. And then like the principal spend their whole day doing that. So I watched them and I thought, God, they all stood together and they're like this. So nobody was doing any teaching of behavior. And so then I talked to them about what would happen if we dispersed the adults and we called you coaches instead of supervisors. And we took off the supervision vest. And we put you strategically out there, and we put you in places where you're strategically teaching kids how to play and how to manage their behavior. And this is them, these two women that were the kings of the yellow vests and the kings of the supervision. And look at them. They are completely now in this coaching mode where they're teaching kids how to play because what we need to do is teach them how, so then they can release this so that these children are completely self-regulated on their own and can play by themselves. But we don't often spend the time doing this, because when you're in a supervision model, you are just waiting for behavior to break down. So this was a huge change up there. And unfortunately, I'm looking at my watch and our time is up already. And here's just a last example of, this is co-regulation. So when I talk about the educational assistance and how we have to move from a co-regulation to self-regulation, any work that I do with educational assistants, I am gently trying to move them from the state of co-regulation. Great to be with them, but we need to set child up with strategies to learn, not the hard skills, but the soft skills. How are we going to learn this? Wean ourselves off to create this self-regulated learning. And so that would be the biggest walk away from today, is going from co-regulation out of behavior compliance to this beautiful self-regulation where a child can articulate, I know what my job is, I know what my plan is, I know if my plan's working or not, and I'm going to go back and check before I go on to my next plan. And so unfortunately, guys, we only have an hour, and so I don't get to share all the work that we can do out in schools, but I can tell you that some of the comments this morning were, are teachers inviting you into their classrooms? And I say yes. Are teachers resisting you? And I say for the most part, no. Are we making changes in classrooms? Yes. And we have lots and lots of data to support the differences in our classrooms. And so if we want to, here's our friend Robin now, if we want to get our children to that state of flow where they're learning at an optimal level, it behooves us to look at all of the areas of self-regulation so that children can go forth and be highly metacognitive and independent self-regulated learners so that they can work in that flow for extended periods of time, and most importantly know when they're in flow and when they're not out of flow, and what to do about it when they get out and how to get themselves back in. That is the key hallmark of self-regulated learning, is to know when you're in flow, when you're getting out of flow, and what you need to do to get back in there so you can stay in that state. So thank you for listening, and my time's up.
We did start a few minutes early, but I just want to tell you that Brenda is our self-regulation speaker today, and she has a timer on her laptop, and she took exactly 60 minutes.
Woo.
Very impressive. BC PAC is really appreciative of you being here today, and we'd like to present you with this honey.
Oh, thank you.
Because that's so sweet.
Thank you. Oh, that's so cool.
We are back here at 2:30 to listen to Robin, so we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great.